Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I share how I plan on planting my spring blooming bulbs in pots. So let's go. I've been growing spring blooming bulbs in pots for about 3 or 4 years now, and I want to share my results have been mixed. This year, I'm planning to run an experiment because I want to see which method works better for me. I don't want to keep doing what I've done in the past and just assume that's the only way to do it. It is early November here in New Hampshire, Zone 5B. This is the time of year when I start seeing a lot of spring blooming bulbs in the big box stores. And I'm always so quick to want to get them planted in my container pots. And one thing I've learned is I need to wait. When it comes to getting them planted out in my landscape, I need to get them planted before the ground freezes. And here where I live, the ground freezes usually by the end of November. But the rule for me is a little different when it comes to planting these bulbs in container pots. Now trust me, I have tried to look up resources on the internet that explain when is the best time to plant spring blooming bulbs in container pots. And I haven't found one resource that explains that, especially because all of us live in different areas, we have different climates and different temperatures. But I wanted to share with you what I've learned. If I wanted to plant my spring blooming bulbs right now in November or even in December, I feel that it's too early for me to plant them in container pots. Now that's if I'm using the same method that I've used for many years, which is then putting the container pots in my unheated garage. That's where I'm sitting right now. My unheated garage doesn't go below 40 degrees Fahrenheit during the coldest parts of the day. The garage is attached to my house, and out of the 5 walls, 4 walls on the side plus the roof, 3 of the walls are interior walls, which mean they're connected to a room inside my house. And that's the reason why this garage never gets as cold as the outside temperature, which in January or February, the temperatures can drop down to negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And what I've learned in the past is if I take my spring blooming bulbs and pot them up, store them in my garage right now, what will end up happening is they'll start sprouting way too early. First, I'll see the green growth, then I'll see the flower buds, and then eventually the flowers will start coming. And the problem that I've found is those plants want to go outside as soon as you see the sprouts coming up. That could be February or March, and unfortunately, it's still way too cold here. And if I was to bring those potted spring bulbs outside during those cold months, unfortunately, they would not survive. If a hard frost or a freeze hits the flower buds or the flowers, I would end up losing those. And not only that, the bulbs themselves, if they're exposed to freezing temperatures, they would freeze and they would also die. A couple of years ago, I was late in getting some of my spring blooming bulbs planted. I got them planted, I think it was like maybe March or April. I had the best display of spring blooming bulbs in pots that year. So for that reason, any container pots that I'm going to build this year that are going to be in this garage will not get built until probably March. And it doesn't end there. I mentioned earlier I'll be running an experiment, and I'll go over that in a little bit. Before we do that, I want to go over some important things you need to know when it comes to planting spring bulbs in pots. Improper chilling. Spring blooming bulbs need a certain cool period in order to bloom. And there's a temperature range that those bulbs need to be successfully chilled. Fortunately, where I live, I don't need to worry about that because the bulbs that are outside are already chilled. And not only that, if I was to go to a store, buy a bag of bulbs, even though those bulbs are not chilled, the bulbs that come into this garage here, they're going to still get that chill period because the garage is cold enough for them to get that period of chill. However, in those warmer climates, if you don't get that consistent temperature, there's a whole process that you have to go through to chill your bulbs. Definitely do a search on the internet. There's a lot of information out there. But I know a lot of people like to take the bulbs and chill them by putting them in their refrigerator. But there are rules about placing those bulbs in place where they're not going to be exposed to ethylene gas that's emitted from certain fruits or vegetables. Poor drainage or overwatering. I would say this is the #1 thing that kills spring blooming bulbs that are in pots. It can be from a ton of rain, it can be from a ton of snow, or even both. Some people like to take a tarp and put that over their pot so that the pot doesn't get a lot of rain, and I've heard that that does help. And well, I've always had the bulbs in their pots here in my garage, so I never had an issue with the rotting of the bulbs. I checked on the bulbs probably every month, and if they seemed dry, I gave them a small drink of water. But that was about it. I just wanted to make sure they weren't fully drying out. But having them rot was never an issue for me because they were protected in the garage. Insufficient sunlight. A majority of spring blooming bulbs really do thrive in full sun, which is usually 6 to 8 hours of sun per day. And it's not necessarily that sunlight that they get when they're first coming up out of the ground, for example. It's later on after the bulbs are done blooming and they're now storing energy. A lot of times the leaves have come out on the trees and they're casting shade on those bulbs. So it's important to make sure that wherever you place those spring blooming bulbs, you're putting them somewhere where they can get 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, not only in the spring, but also in the early summer months when the bulbs are storing their energy for the next year. Premature removal of foliage. Many of us don't like to look at the leaves of our spring blooming bulbs after they've gone by. It can be a little unsightly, but it's important to leave the leaves on there. And at a minimum, you want to leave the leaves on there at least 6 to 8 weeks after the bulbs are done blooming. By then, the bulbs have stored up enough energy. But if you want to play it safe, you can just keep the leaves on there until they naturally die back and turn brown. Freezing. Well, that never has been a problem for me with the bulbs that are in my garage because it doesn't go below freezing. And in case you're wondering, wait a minute, what about those bulbs that are out in the landscape? Especially here in New Hampshire, our ground freezes. But remember, the ground freezes, but only to a certain depth. And not only that, it's very consistent in the ground. In other words, up above on top of the ground, there's the freezing, thawing cycle. But anything that's beneath soil level, it's more consistent. So the bulbs that are in the ground, they're getting good drainage, so they're not rotting. They're also not going through that freeze-thaw cycle. That if you had bulbs in a pot and they're outdoors, they're absolutely going to experience the freeze-thaw cycles. And if it gets too cold, which in our climate, it does get that cold, the freezing of those bulbs in the pots would kill the bulbs. Sheltered location. So here I am, I'm in a sheltered location, my unheated garage. The bulbs are fine in here because they are sheltered. But again, I think that it's a little too warm if I was to plant the bulbs right now. So this location is fine where I'm in right now, as long as I plant them a little bit later in my season. Now, you might not have a garage and you might be wondering, I want to have spring blooming bulbs in pots. So what do I do if I don't have a sheltered location like a garage? You can still put them in a pot and have them outside. The biggest thing you want to be careful of is too much moisture. It will rot those bulbs. And if the temperatures go below freezing for a number of days, then you are going to have to find a place to put the pot. If it just froze for 1 day or 2 days, I can't speak to that because I haven't tried it. And honestly, I don't want to experiment with that. But that's something you might want to look up, is how many days can spring blooming bulbs stay in a container pot during those freezing nights. But if it were me, I would try to bring the pots in on the nights that you have freezing temperature. But other than that, you could probably just keep your pots outside under a covered porch or somewhere like where they're not going to get too much rain or too much snow. So now let's talk about my experiment. One container pot is going to still stay in the garage, but I know it's going to be an issue because we are planting them on the early side and they're going to probably sprout too early for me. And yet I can't bring them outside in March or April because the temperatures are still freezing. So I'm going to have to see what I end up doing at that time. We're going to do another container pot and we're going to put it out in my shed. My shed is not attached to my house. It definitely gets pretty cold out there. So my worry is that the bulbs might freeze, but I still won't know that unless I do the experiment. And then the third pot is going to get healed into the ground. And what that means is I take a shovel and I dig a hole, and I'm going to dig the hole just as deep as that pot. I'll take the pot and I'll sink it into the hole. Then I'll take the soil and backfill all around the pot, basically just leaving the top lip of the pot as well as the top of the pot exposed. Now, it's very important that all these pots have drainage holes in them. By mistake, if I overwater any of the pots that are in the shed or the barn, those bulbs can rot. And for that pot that's going to be healed into the ground, I need it to have the drainage holes so when it snows, when it rains, it can drain out. So here's the one thing I want to share. The bulbs that we're going to be using today are bulbs that I dug up from my backyard. There were some blooms, but many of them did not bloom because that area was too shady. And so the bulbs just didn't store up enough energy. So the purpose of this experiment is not necessarily to see which of these bulbs are going to put on the best show. It's more to see which ones are coming up quicker, which ones are coming up slower. And I also want to see, are the bulbs in the shed going to freeze this winter? But don't worry, I have a lot of other bulbs that I need to get planted. They were bulbs that I had in container pots last spring. And what I did in the summertime was I took them out of the pots, I put them in paper bags, I stored all those bulbs in my basement during the summer months, and now I need to find a place to put them. I'm going to be putting them in pots and containers. All of those pots and containers will be healed in to the ground because I feel most confident that that's the best way to do this process. And the reason I say that is I feel that the temperatures are very consistent, and those bulbs that are in the pots that are going to be sunk in the ground are no different than bulbs that are out in my landscape. They will come up whenever they're ready. They will be acclimated to the temperatures out there. They're not going to come up too fast because it's too warm. They're not going to come up too slow or freeze because they are going to be healed into the ground just like the rest of the bulbs are out in my landscape. And we're not going to be planting all those bulbs today. I just wanted to share that a majority of my bulbs that I'm putting in container pots will be healed into the ground this year. And then finally, I'm not worrying about decorative pots. I think it would be too much work for me to worry about that. However, if you only have a small handful of bulbs and you want some really decorative pots, by all means, you can do that. What I'm planning to do is just use some plastic plain containers, nothing fancy, get all my bulbs planted. And then next year, as things start coming up, especially the plants that I'm healing in the nursery, I can then take them out of the ground and I can put them in pretty containers however I want to do during that time. In this tote, I have a mixture of used potting mix as well as homemade compost. The ratios don't matter. The key is to make sure whatever soil you're using, it's well draining. In this 5-gallon bucket are some bulbs. We actually dug these up together in a previous video. I'll link it down below. These were bulbs that were in a shadier part of my yard, and that's why they've already started sprouting and creating roots. So what I'll be doing is I'm going to be picking out the larger bulbs just because I want to have a chance of seeing some blooms, hopefully. I'd rather not take the smaller bulbs because they were divisions off the larger bulbs and they most likely will not bloom next year. We'll be using this container here. You can see it's 8 inches deep. You normally want to allow for about 2 inches in the bottom of any container pot for root development. And I mentioned earlier we want to plant the bulbs 6 inches deep, so this will be perfect, planting them right here. And we don't need to be exact. It's about an estimate. So I'm putting in our potting mix. At this point, I could add something like bulb tone, a bulb fertilizer. That's optional. I don't have any on hand, so I'm not going to add it. I'm making sure to place the bulbs pointy side up. And in this case, it's very obvious. You can see the roots. The roots are down near the soil. But if you were to buy brand new bulbs, just make sure pointy side is up, flat side is down. And when I put my bulbs in here, I definitely plant them nice and close, closer than I would have in the landscape, because I want this pot full of color. For the bulbs in the garage, I need to be careful because the fumes that come from the exhaust in your car can do damage to the bulbs. So you just want to be cautious of that if you have a car or cars in your garage where you're going to be having your spring bulbs for the winter. I'm going to keep a thermometer in my garage, and I'm also going to keep a thermometer in my barn. I just want to be able to monitor the temperature, especially during our coldest months in January and February. Okay, I'd say that's as many bulbs as we can fit. I can go ahead and now cover the bulbs with the potting mix. For the bulbs that are going to be in my barn has 2 levels to it. I'm assuming that upstairs in the barn will be warmer than downstairs, just because usually heat rises. So my plan is to bring that pot upstairs and keep it up there. And I'll also monitor the temperature just so I know what the temperature is at in January and February in the barn. If I wanted to, I could insulate the pot with like bubble wrap, the pot that's going to be in the barn. For this year, I'm not going to bother, but that might be a good experiment for me to do next year if I find that the bulbs in the pot end up freezing. This potting mix is pretty wet. But if I wanted to, I could come in and just give this a small drink of water, and that's it. I wouldn't give it any more water until it starts to feel dry. That's important. I am going to have to check it probably once a month, and I like to take my finger, put it in 1 to 2 inches, and if it's dry down that deep, I would give it just the smallest drink of water. And I'll be showing you that every month throughout the winter. I'll be copying this with 2 more pots, the same exact process. 1 pot's going to go in my unheated garage that's attached to my house. A second pot's going to go upstairs in my unheated barn that's not attached to the house where it gets colder. And then the third pot's going to get healed into the ground. I'm going to dig out a hole big enough so that I can sink this whole entire pot from the bottom to right here into the ground on all sides. So the only thing that I would see in the ground is the top part of this pot and nothing else. And I'll be healing this down in my plant nursery, which is on my property. And for the pot that's outside, I won't have to water it again because within a few weeks, the ground will be freezing, and we also get rain and snow, so I'm not too worried. But if you lived in an area where you had a pot outside and you weren't getting rain or snow, you want to do the same thing. Just put your finger in, check it 1 to 2 inches deep. If the soil feels dry, then go ahead and give it a small drink of water. I have a lot of other videos on my channel that show what to do with spring blooming bulbs after you're done with them, especially those ones in container pots. I also have videos that show you my process for digging up, dividing, and moving spring bulbs. And that's very important if you want to increase your stock in them and have more flowers. So be sure to check out those videos that I've linked below. If you have any questions or comments, I love hearing from you. Drop them down in the comments section. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.